Well, it was a wide-ranging speech by President Macron. He also spoke of what he called a weakening Europe on the world stage. Have a listen.
I believe that the international context is becoming more complicated and that there is a risk of a weakening of the West, and more particularly of our Europe. Firstly, there's a dilution of our population and our produced wealth, of our share in the world trade. This has become even more true since the crisis of 2008 to 2010 and is a result of the emergence of major international powers.
Well, listening to that with me was Douglas Herbert, our foreign affairs commentator. And Doug, so Macron there speaking about sort of anti-Western sentiment being on the rise. And he actually had a warning, didn't he?
Yeah, he absolutely does. Well, the warning is the weakening of both the European, the Western model, and more specifically the European model within the sort of international order that's being upended. What he said is not in and of itself shocking. It's not stop the presses stuff. We know that there has been disinformation, there has been trolling, there has been populism, there has been the rise of regional powers that haven't always been forged in the same, as you would see, a democratic mold as a lot of the Western democracies upon which the international order, at least in the post-war period, has been based. What he attributes this dividing, this, as you will, balkanization of the world into several poles, is the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and the waging of the war against Ukraine, which has really forced a lot of the world, especially a lot of the developing and poorer countries in the world that are more dependent on Russia, into a more subservient position with respect to Russia. They can't really afford to condemn Russia's stance with Ukraine. They don't have the luxury, you might argue, to stand up against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the same way that more developed, richer, more prosperous Western democracies, the U.S. and Europe, can do. So there's that on the one hand, but then there's also this, like I said, this division, the southern versus the northern world, and this rise, as Macron would put it, of real resentment, anti-Western resentment. Now, that resentment might be, as he said, real or imagined, or based on the manipulation by leaders with their own interests. There have been a lot of putches across Africa, but what's indisputable is there has been the rise of this anti-Western sentiment, both in Africa, many countries in Africa, also in Asia, and it is striking, and it is more virulent than it has been perhaps in more recent decades. He says this resentment is going to be a danger going ahead, along with, as you said, the rise of these new powers. Saudi Arabia, he didn't mention it by name, prime among them, exerting its influence on the world stage. Another country not exactly known for its staunch defense of human rights and democratic models, at least not as the West perceives them. So these are all challenges for Macron, to use a very mild word, but as he would say, a danger is perhaps, that's the warning, the danger of stark divisions as you have going ahead, these very differing models of governance.
And when we think about these kinds of divisions, Doug, is it fair to say that we see them within Europe as well, perhaps even within France?
What's fascinating right now playing out in France is sort of a mini polemic, of what Macron was saying. Former president here, Nicolas Sarkozy, gave an interview in the past couple of days to a newspaper, Le Figaro, a mainstream newspaper, and the TF1, which is a private TV station, which he basically said that any hopes that Ukraine has of getting Crimea back are completely illusory. He said Ukraine shouldn't even entertain any notions of joining NATO or the European Union, and basically saying that Russia must remain a friend. And what's interesting here, this isn't some African a junta leader in some African country saying this, who resents Macron and resents colonialism and all of that. This is a former French president who you might not say, yes, Europe has remained solid and united in supporting Ukraine up until this point, but the fact that a former French president, and not far right, just a right-wing conservative French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, it very much resonates with the types of stuff we're hearing on the fringe in Germany with the Alternative for Germany movement, in Italy, where, yes, the Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been supportive of Ukraine and has gone along with the European solidarity in favor of Ukraine, but is still of a far-right movement where a lot of the voices there are very much, have a lot of sympathies with Russia. And right here in France, not just the far right, far left too, those age-old historical traditional sympathies for Russia remain.
And very briefly, Doug, has there been a response from Ukraine to all of this?
Well, Ukraine's trying to lock in some sort of support going down the road. It knows what it's up against. It sees this hardening of Western opinion and perhaps a tapering of Western solidarity with Ukraine. It's seeking perhaps an Israel-style agreement with the United States for aid. What does that mean? In a nutshell, it means that it wouldn't be a NATO member, right? Israel's not a NATO member, but it's it's a country that has been able to rely on deep and solid cooperation and military and aid from the United States to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars over a decade in recent years. So regardless of who's president, regardless of what the political line is in the U.S., if it had that Israel-style aid relationship with the U.S., the hope would be Ukraine would be locked in now and in the future in terms of support from a key ally, perhaps its most important one.
Really interesting analysis. Thanks very much indeed, Douglas Herbert, for us there.